All righty. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. It's been a long time coming, but finally, we're doing an episode all about Mexico, only about Mexico. So, in our All Things Latin America edition, our All Things Mexico, we welcome to the program a returning champion, Jay Watts, former central organizer of the Communist Party of Canada. He's now based in Mexico, where he is part of the Mexico Solidarity Campaign and is involved in several other people power movements and anti-imperialist activities in Mexico City. He's also a photographer, and I consider him a historian and walking encyclopedia on the broad left, communist movement, figures, and culture. And yes, we'll be discussing U.S.-Mexican relations, the legacy of AMLO, the Mexican center-left president who is stepping down, and the efforts to undermine him, the new Mexican president-elect who is from AMLO's party, Morena, and no doubts, tons of more. So first off, Jay, welcome back to the show. It's an honor to have you back on the program.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Yeah, I mean, I'll do my best to live up to that introduction. I guess a bit of a caveat. I think, I've been in Mexico for almost 2 years now. I was visiting before that a bunch before I moved down here. And I would say that I'm definitely not the most qualified person to speak about the Mexican left or anything, but I feel that given what I've read over the past couple of weeks, I feel at least qualified to debunk some things and maybe give a bit of clarity about what Morena is, where it came from, what AMLO's done, what Claudia might do, what are the other contradictions involved in the project, and stuff like that. But I would also encourage, and hopefully I'll mention them throughout, other people like Kurt Hackbarth, who I work with at Mexico Solidarity Project. He's a writer for Jacobin. He's been here a lot longer than me, and he writes in English very well. He's based in Oaxaca. Jose Luis Granado Ceja, who's from Venezuela Analysis. He's also working with the Mexico Solidarity Project. And those two guys, they have a podcast called Soberania, which is really, really good. It really contextualizes everything that's happening. It came out weekly during the election. It might move to something a little slower, but they're really hammering on really important elements of the AMLO project as a global South developmentalist project, why sovereignty is important, the limits it has, how it is a project of the left, even if it has some of these contradictory elements. So I would also encourage, if you want more specific and grounded information, those are two good places to start. But I'm happy to talk today.
Well, fantastic, and funny that you mention Kurtz because just preparing for like the show today, I finally got the chance to watch a bunch of Breakthrough News' coverage. We've had Rania Kalik on the program before. I was actually watching Breakthrough News' coverage of it, and Kurtz was one of their guests. So so on the show notes, people will be able to dig deep into him. Hopefully, if they watch the Breakthrough News interviews he's done. So brilliant. All right, let's get underway. My first question, actually, Jay, is which is sort of related to Mexico. I want your thoughts actually on the passing of John Pilger. Now, you've seen a number of his documentaries. He did 3 on Latin America: The Mexicans, Nicaragua, A Nation's Right to Survive, and The War on Democracy. And with respect to the country that we're about to do a deep dive in, Pilger's first documentary, of course, on Latin America was The Mexicans, and he was still a reporter for the Daily Mirror when he did that documentary. So briefly, how bad has Mexico's chronic woes gotten worse since that documentary, or how has the situation of chronic poverty, political repression, and the constant fleeing for a supposedly better life in the U.S., much of it illegally, so has the situation gone worse or improved since John made that documentary on on Mexico?
I'd say since then, I mean, if I recall correctly, it's been a while since I watched it, but one of the conceits or ideas that Pilger was identifying then was the great possibility economically and socially that Mexico had, and it's probably 81 or 82 when it came out. And part of that was because of the sort of public development and ownership of oil, that there was a second oil boom going on. It was an OPEC producing nation, et cetera, et cetera. That promise really in the 80s. In the 80s began a process of sort of the neoliberal process in Mexico, which carried on up until 6 years ago and still is in force, because obviously that you can't just put a complete break on it.
Yeah.
The 80s were a time, and I'm going to give you a really quick cliff note. The 80s were a time when basically uh the government at the time privatized almost everything they could get their hands on. So since the after the Mexican Revolution in 1911, the sort of left government that really consolidated power was the Cardenas government, which is just before World War II. So that was also when they nationalized the Seven Sisters, which were the big oil companies, expropriated all of the oil production for the people, created Pemex within Mexico. A lot of other really progressive things were happened. The first and probably largest example of indigenous land back happened under Cardenas. It was like a lot of land went back to indigenous people. This is one of the things that I think, and I'm going to go to background what's happening with Morena and why it might be possible, is that the Mexican Revolution, while not a socialist revolution, occurred within a population that was primarily peasant based, that had and still has a lot of progressive elements that are found within the Constitution, including the idea of public ownership above all, that the state, as a representative of the people, has the right to take what it wants, that private ownership is not such a huge thing here. So basically, after World War II and beyond, there was some backsliding. PRI as a party consolidated its hold with a mixture of sort of clientelism, which is delivering social programs to its base, buying off the peasantry, buying off workers, but also sliding further to the right, to the point you get to the 70s. There was essentially a communist revolution based in Guerrero and other states, that also, I mean, there's so much stuff going on, but also formed the basis of the drug war, right? Is that the drug war, part of what happened was that it was an excuse for the Mexican government at the time, the Mexican state at the time, and the United States to do a program of counterinsurgency against what they felt was going to be a socialist revolution that would take over Mexico, because of sort of the unreliability of the PRI as having leftists and peasant roots. That meant that the United States really came in forcefully, and in my reading, and probably a lot of other people's reading on the left, created the drug cartels in order to deal with the possibility of socialist revolution. So Mexico is coming into that in the 80s. Pilger makes this documentary. There's an oil boom. Pemex has always been very strong. It's always been able to deliver a lot of wealth and jobs to Mexicans. That didn't happen. They privatized basically everything. And when I say privatized, I mean people. I guess I came from Canada, which had, compared to the United States, a stronger social sector. There was a thing called Petro-Canada, which was an state oil corporation. There was Air Canada, which was publicly owned before. But Mexico had really like a lot more substantive public sector, like grocery stores. Now they still do have public grocery stores, but a lot of other stuff. So they gutted that out. And then the second sort of wound that was inflicted on the Mexican people was the NAFTA, which was started in 1988 as the free trade agreement of the free trade agreement, and then was finally signed in 1994. That began the process of destroying rural Mexico, of destroying the possibility for food sovereignty, of corn production. The United States dumped in a lot of subsidized corn, and for a lot of Mexicans, they had basically a sustenance existence. They could do a little bit of work, but they had enough corn production within, outside of the cities, that they could live off of that. That massively increased the proletarization of Mexico, so that people went in to work at what are called the maquiladoras primarily along the northern border with the United States, the sweatshops. That's also the basis of migration. There wasn't as much migration coming from Mexico to the United States until NAFTA. So these both of those processes, I would say, were carried on behalf of US imperialism by the ruling class, the comprador ruling class of Mexico, which is primarily now within the two parties who just suffered a massive defeat, the PRI, the Popular Institutional Revolutionary Party, and the PAN, the Action Party Action Nationale, which was a sort of Catholic fascist group that came out of the post-revolution. I mean, there's so much stuff. There's a post-revolutionary situation with the Cristero War, where there was a very strong anti-clerical movement within the revolutionary current of Mexico to basically move the Catholic Church out. So there is still the Catholic Church is very prominent here, and but there's also still within the Constitution. I mean, it's said that it should really not take any part in any politics. So those two periods, I would say, were the two big, strong, and deep wounds that carried on the immiseration of the Mexican people. And it wasn't until 2018 that sort of really stopped. However, in 1988, the left did win, but under Cuauhtemoc Cardenas, who was the son of Lázaro Cárdenas, and you can read the New York Times stuff around that time. Basically, the left had won. They started a new party, PRD, which AMLO came out of too. Lots of these people came out of the left wing of the PRI. They won. The government said, "Oh, something happened. The computers that we used to tabulate it aren't working." It was revealed pretty quickly thereafter that actually that they didn't
So
use computers at all.
this is actually depicted in one of those stupid Narcos series where they were covering the Mexican cartel, and they actually
Yeah.
showed that, and it's actually quite
So that's
yeah.
that's one of many stolen elections from the left, which sort of facilitated so the PRD continues on. 2006, there's another obviously stolen election, which is AMLO was the candidate at that time. It was stolen by him. The man who became president illegally under that time was Calderon. Calderon started something with the United States, basically based on the Plan Colombia, which was a intense. I mean, they talk about the militarization of society. This was the reality of it. Like homicide spiked up. It was murder. There was kidnapping. It was a really, really horrific time. And what we've discovered since then, especially with the jailing of Genaro Garcia Luna in the United States, was that essentially the United States and the Mexican elite conspired to bring a war to certain cartels. That's an imprecise term, but let's say organized crime groups on behalf of one organized crime group. So it was basically to try to create a monopolization of system, and that crime group is the one, the Sinaloa cartel, that works primarily with the CIA. And why does the CIA work with these drug groups and stuff like that? For many reasons. Counterinsurgency is how it started with, but also because it provides a lot of money to finance capital and transnational corporations in the United States. It provides an extra budget for the CIA outside of the prying eyes of American politicians, although they don't pry too much these days. And so the opening that created so many of the problems and issues that basically made Mexicans fed up enough to massively vote for Morena in 2018 when AMLO finally won. And at that time, 2012, he also ran as well, didn't win. 2018 is when people had enough of Peña Nieto, who was another sort of neoliberal leader.
Bootlegger
Yeah.
for oligarchy,
Yeah,
for Western imperialists,
yeah.
and
And so by 2018, the left, as it was, had left PRD, the Party of the Democratic Revolution, and had found Morena, which has started as sort of a social movement organization, bringing in, and still has that elements, but became more of a party. So I don't know, that was just unloading and not particularly answering your question, but I think that, yeah, it's funny that I think Pilger was correct. I mean, it didn't happen that Mexico did have another Mexican miracle, but all of those ingredients were there, and it's very sad and very unfortunate that a country as rich in resources, history, civilization, culture, people, everything has just been looted for decades, because everything that is here is the possibility of it being a very, very good place to live. That's existed for decades. But I mean, that's the old quote. I forget who it was, but it was Porfirio Diaz. But Mexico, so close to heaven, so far from heaven, so close to the United States of America.
Well, rest in peace. Yeah, rest in peace and rest in power to John Pilger. And it would have been very interesting. I would have, I would have loved to have I would have loved to have interviewed him. And all of the questions I basically would have like prepared for that interview is how do it's just him like reflecting like how has the situation changed in Japan since you covered it, since Mexico since you covered it, since all of Latin America since there was the rolling back of the very fragile gains of the pink tide, and I would have loved to have asked him all those questions, yeah, but that's a perfect segue now to this question I wanted to ask you, and you already kind of addressed it, but let's do a deeper dive into it, which is this. So, when one thinks of Mexico and US Mexican relations, one thinks of a very colonial relation where Mexico is often exploited by US corporations and many multinationals from Europe and Canada. Canada, which has to be a topic for another day, but Canada as well. And the US tends to prop up very regressive oligarchies, and as you mentioned, competing drug cartels. So, talk to us more about that and how it's developed from the Monroe Doctrine era to the Cold War to the NAFTA, to the NAFTA era. So, if there's anything more that you want to talk, please, enlighten us.
So I would say through that period of neoliberalization and privatization, a certain strata of the Mexican upper class, let's say a lower strata than the traditional elites, than the traditional like Spanish elites, got very, very rich. So this is middle management people, comprador people who would Carlos Slim, for example, is one although contradictorily does generally like the current government, which I'll get into a bit later.
Okay.
But basically, and you can see it in the politics here. The politics here of the Mexican right are not like a shade away from fascist. Not if they're like it's outright racist, classist, like horrific sort of stuff that doesn't get covered by the European or American press because they're able to, and especially Trump has helped a lot, right? They're able to put a progressive veneer on themselves externally by saying, look at this AMLO guy. He's an authoritarian populist, just like Trump. Don't investigate any further. We told you that. That's good enough. But if you want to, I think one good thing that anybody could do if you want to really get a handle on Mexican politics, especially in the next little week, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of stuff going over the election and that, open up TikTok, look through some like Mexican left accounts. You'll be able to come across the opposition here basically has a foothold or control of most of the private media. And a lot of that private media too became what it is because of privatization, because after privatization, the pre and pan governments, the right-wing governments, neoliberal governments gave tons of money to subsidize these people, which is why they're furious. The current government doesn't do that. So they're out of, and I'm talking like the level of inequality here is crazy. It's very, very unequal in a way that I think people in Europe or Canada, the United States can't even fathom. Like how much money and public money has gone to these people is just bizarre. And also their wages and benefits and things like that. So these people have become rich through their facilitation of capital penetration by transnational, primarily European and US corporations. You look at where there's a reason why almost all of the living ex-presidents in Mexico are now like hiding out abroad or living in Spain, like Peña Nieto and Calderon, and working for Spanish energy companies that benefited from the privatization of energy
Yeah.
in Mexico. Right. And that's because that's what they were doing. That was their job. Their job was to loot the Mexican state for the benefit of private capital, primarily foreign private capital. So, and that's still, that tension is still existing right now. I think the why the dynamic has changed and why Morena is able to do stuff is because China decided a little while ago, as part of their, I would say, progress towards, well, they say progress towards creating a moderately prosperous socialist society. You can say, okay, progress towards, they don't want to be a middle, they want to avoid the middle income trap, is that they were going to get out of low wage manufacturing because they didn't need it anymore, right? That it fulfilled the goal, which was uh China in 1979, 1978 was very, 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 very poor. It had a lot of people. It didn't have a lot of technology. It didn't have a lot of resources. The sort of transformation of China to a market socialist economy or a mercantilist economy, whatever you want to call it, was done by calculating that it could use the labor of people in order to enact a technology transfer. And so I think it's true. It's right now. Why is the United States being like, okay, we can't let electric vehicles from China into the United States because they're too good and they're too cheap. So something worked properly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
basically, Mexico has already been through a globalization process of using and exploiting the labor pool it has here and the proximity of the United States. And that was during NAFTA. And it did not make people's lives better. It made it markedly worse. Prior to NAFTA, the living standards of Mexican workers, and because of the sustenance economy with corn, was not like amazing, but it was good. It was better than what happened during NAFTA. And so now they kind of have a second kick at the can because China wants to get out of that, because the United States still needs stuff coming from China. It also allows, you can see this in the charts, it's very clearly that a lot of material is still coming from China, getting assembled in Mexico, and then going to the United States. And so there's a really important opportunity for Mexico right now that I think they're taking advantage of, which is to allow capital penetration, direct investment here, but under as much command as they can muster within the economy, within the constitution, and things still need to be changed. And that includes what they're doing right now, which is massive public infrastructure projects, development of the South, which has traditionally never had any development. And they're thinking that hopefully that's going to produce better results for people, and it will, and it has. And the minimum wage has doubled since 2018. People's purchasing power is a lot better. There's direct cash transfers. They made all of these very progressive changes while a pandemic happened, and a pandemic happened to a country that really did not have the ability like other countries to make people stop working or do things like that. It didn't have that, and it did it also without directly increasing taxes. Basically, I think that Mexico has been so corrupt for so long that all you need for a bit, anyways, for a bit, I don't think totally, but for a bit, is to just run the government sort of semi-competently, and all of a sudden magically money starts showing up and you're able to use, the state budget to do things. And so that's what's happening, and that's where we are right now. And the Morena members I've talked to, it's called the fourth transformation. They think the first transformation, there's three previous transformations, including the revolution, the war of independence, etc., that happened before. They consider this the fourth transformation. It's an anti-neoliberal transformation. They don't call it socialism. It's called Mexican humanism. And they think it's going to take a while. This is why Claudia Sheinbaum refers to it as her 6-year period is the second floor of the fourth transformation, is that nobody thinks of it as it's going to be solved in 6 years or even 12 years, all of the problems and issues that are happening, including the forcible underdevelopment, imperialism, the things that they have to deal with. But because of what's happening with China, the proximity to the United States, there is this opening that I think is that they've really been able to deliver things for capital that they're happy with and things for people and social development at the same time. That's not going to be able to continue forever, but for now it is.
If I could ask a quick follow-up question before we talk about PRI as a political
Yeah.
institution, major political party, and so forth. If I could ask a quick follow-up question about the history of U.S. Imperialism in Mexico, and of course, completely forgot to mention, it's important to mention this, though, when we do talk about Mexican history, is that half of Mexico's country was stolen by the United States.
Yeah.
Manifest destiny, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
California, New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, I believe Utah. There's sort of a weird Utah element uh, in there, but
Yeah.
basically all of that was Mexico. And Abraham Lincoln, and I believe it was either Abraham Lincoln or the president after him that basically like continued on with Manifest
Annexed
Destiny,
it.
stole half of the country from it, genocided the indigenous people and so forth. So that's very important
Yeah.
to mention.
Yeah, and those are very productive, oil-rich lands. The population there was primarily mestizo, with Spanish background. I mean, I I have a lot of respect for Mexican nationalists, and I think that there's a lot good about it. I think when you're talking about stolen part of the country, I mean, just because of the experience of like indigenous land theft, I don't want to go too far down that, but it is a reality that a lot of the productive capacity of the United States for a long period of the 20th century and part of the 19th century came from exploiting the resources that were previously Mexico, as they say. So yeah, that's definitely a big thing. I think the United States of America has invaded Mexico 14 to 20 times or so. There's been that many invasions. So, and actually where I live in a part of southern Mexico City, where one of the final battles was fought with the Americans, and it led to the second largest mass execution in United States history. The first was actually Lincoln, as you mentioned, and the second one was of Irish soldiers who had defected from the United States and fought on the side of the Mexicans against the invasion, and who are recognized and commemorated here in Mexico quite a bit. So yeah, it's a very prominent and present history for Mexicans. It's not recent. It's not too far back. It's something that's continuously and thought of.
But what made now Mexico's always had this problem because of this very colonial relation that they have with the United States. So Pilger also addressed this in his in his documentary. Those who would illegally flee their impoverishment, flee the grotesque poverty that they were living under to go
Yeah.
search for a better life, in the United States, where oftentimes, so they're there illegally. Of course, they get exploited grotesquely by their employers and so forth. And
Yeah.
so, what was the difference between that level of migration and then and then and then NAFTA, which NAFTA kind of legalizes more of the exploitation that American corporations and other multinational corporations were doing on Mexico, and then of course, yes.
So
Yeah,
that's
talk to us a bit about that.
That's a really good question. I've been thinking about this and talking this about with friends and comrades for a while now too. And I also have to say, like, I do not know everything about Mexican history. I've only been here 2 years. I'm trying to like get up to speed to as much of it. But my reading of this is that there are two issues that I think fundamentally will never be dealt with properly by Mexico autonomously, as long as the United States of America is what it is. And the
Okay.
first one is migration, and the second one is drugs. I think migration as it exists because the United States of America wants a pliable and scared labor force. There are entire states in the United States, like Idaho and the dairy industry, that depend explicitly on exploited migrant labor, that both parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, are funded by people who benefit from that the Democrats, in a way, want the illusion that they will provide a path of citizenship because there's enough of a voting bloc that they'll do it, but they also don't want it. I mean, you see right now Biden talking about, oh, we'll shut down the border, and actually maybe we're going to ship these migrants to southern Italy or Greece, where they can be labor there, which is like, it's explicit now because he's sort of competing with Trump, but that's always been the position of Democrats and Republicans, that there will never be a Democratic presidential candidate for that party who actually would put forward a program that gave a real path to citizenship. Because why would you want that? They're addicted to the profit you can make from that. Same with the Republicans too, right? These Republicans do not want it. Like, if they got, you think really they're gonna deport all of the like Latin American migrants that do like all of the work that they make so much money? They're basically like a slave population in the United States that you can use also to discipline the legal working population. They are totally addicted to that. It will never be dealt with. And this is why when AMLO presents his project of like, oh, if you want to like deal with migration, remove the sanctions, give some money for these and which he actually is doing too in Central America, is in Honduras. I believe they're giving money for a reforestation project, stuff like that. So this is the curse of Mexico, is that it can't deal with it. And right now Mexico is being used as a second, like a southern border, a second southern border, of having a second southern border for migrants who are often coming through. Because I think there's less now Mexican migrants coming over than there is from Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cubans, of course, El Salvador, other countries there. So yeah, I don't, sadly, I don't think as long as the United States of America is the imperialist capitalist country it is, they'll ever be able to deal with migration in Mexico. It's impossible. And then
I actually do have a follow-up question to that, but
yeah,
I'm going to ask it much later when we do talk about
yeah,
AMLO and his legacy. So
sure.
so let me ask you this question then, which is yeah, now one can't talk about Mexican history without, of course, talking about the pre-party, which in English is the Institutional Revolutionary Party.
Yeah,
Nobel Prize in the winner of the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1990, Peruvian novelist Mario Vargas Llosa. I think that's how you pronounce
yeah,
his name. And now, not a leftist, but he once claimed, but he once said this. He famously described Mexico under the PRI as being the perfect dictatorship, stating, I don't believe that there has been in Latin America any case of a system of dictatorship which has so efficiently recruited the intellectual milieu, bribing it with great subtlety. The perfect dictatorship is not communism, nor the USSR, nor Fidel Castro. Those are communists, but whatever. The perfect dictatorship is Mexico because it is a camouflage dictatorship. The phrase became popular in Mexico and around the world until the PRI fell from power in 2000, and of course that came from Wikipedia. So yes, please do talk to us about talk to us about the PRI party.
so when PAN came in 2000, it also created something that people refer now to it as PRIAN, and which, as we've seen in the last election, also included the PRD. Basically, all of the sort of Mexican ruling class structure aligned itself that way. So the promise of democratization in 2000, stuff like that, was never really done, and it just created another sort of strata of intellectuals. If you watch a lot of the intellectuals, let's say Denise Dresser is probably a more prominent one that you'll see commenting in the Atlantic or other places like that, or referred to in a lot of speeches. She was a political scientist at one of the universities here, presented herself as sort of a vaguely progressive critic of the PRI and of the PAN. She's shown herself in this last election to be entirely anti-democratic, fascist, against racist, classist against. Today she posted something whining, was like, democracy is some Star Wars reference. Democracy dies, not with a whimper, but with a round of applause, in reference to the gigantic election that like handed over, like Mexicans themselves voted and they did not like what she had to say or what she was put on offer. But yeah, there was a lot of public money from pre and later PAN went into giving money to intellectuals, buying their books, funding their magazines that no one read, things like that. So there's a class of not so organic intellectuals that existed here throughout the 60s and 70s who even fashion themselves as something of leftists, who are distinctly not, who are living off of the sort of state funding and public funding of the cultural superstructure. But I guess it wasn't that perfect because it didn't last. So, but yeah, I think that's something that is remarkable to look at now, is because Mexico does have a strong left history, and there are leftist intellectuals and stuff, and some of them who are in Morena, like Paco Ignacio Taibo Dos, who are engaged in sort of proper, I would say, democratic intellectual pursuits. He's the head of the state publisher here, which also runs uh, public bookstores throughout the country, because it's wild here. The cultural industry was so controlled by an elite group for so long that books here are incredibly expensive, more expensive than in Canada or the United States, but without obviously the possibility of the population to buy it. So the state publisher publishes a lot of stuff, including the 3 editions of Marx's Capital, which they've done even under pre-governments actually, but a lot of other stuff, very cheap, more popular books and stuff like that of political economy that people are able to access to. They run a series of book festivals that give out free books to people. He's engaged in like providing reading clubs. So there's that history of captured intellectuals, the Crows family, other people like that, who are terrible and awful, and exactly what Mario Vargas was saying. And then there's also the sort of like strong left population that comes out of the Communist Party, the agrarian movement of popular education, that now has a partial foothold or space within the Mexican state that is taking away the privileges of these previous bought intellectuals and sort of doing popular education and things like that. So it's impressive to see.
But you said that even so even with like the history of the United States brutally exploiting Mexico, cheap labor and whatnot, that the pre, which is like this big, well, they call themselves like a big tent party, but it's basically like a right wing party, a major right wing party.
No.
But you said that under pre, this is not too dissimilar to other dominant right wing parties that that dominate the landscape. I believe Japan has a similar thing with the liberal Democrat Party,
Democrats, yeah.
the Liberal National Coalition of Australia, and even the Conservative Party before Thatcher. Like they did have to concede to some of the popular left demands and liberal demands. So you mentioned that that under pre there was state-owned oil companies, there was a little bit of like nationalization, but then all of that got
There's
rolled back during the 1980s, the dawn of monetarism, Thatcherism,
yeah.
Reaganism, and
Yeah, and
talk
there
to us
was
about that.
even in the 60s, there was still, prior to 1968 was the massacre that happened parallel to the Olympics, by a president who is now revealed to be on the CIA payroll. But the president before that, now forgive me, I forget his name, but he is recognized right now by AMLO and stuff, created the CFA, which is the large electrical infrastructure network throughout the country, which is not an easy task for a mountainous and very geographically diverse country like Mexico. A lot of the private companies and the Spanish companies that have profited from privatization right now still exist on the backbone of what the public state created, right? But what had happened from the beginning of the before they were even under Cardenas, was a multi-sector approach to dominating groups, including the campesinos, so the peasants. Peasantry had their own organization, which the became to dominate. There's also the sort of national union federation, which created these unions, which are now considered, and they are company unions. Not all of them now, and that's another thing that's happening too. There's a big labor reform going on, but basically the was a party for all people, but not really for the people in terms of how they dominated people. And that came through what we would call clientelism, right? Delivering social programs, but only if you were in the party or in an organization connected to the party. And that legacy of corruption is still with us. It's still, I would say, seeps in through it exists in Morena. There are people who come from other parties who are from political families which exist in a way regionally and stuff that aren't so obvious within the United States or Canada, but here they're very obvious and people are connected, and so that way of doing politics is still very prominent. And I think it has elements of it that have gone over to Morena, and that's a lot of what people are talking about right now. I don't know how valid it is. That is because Morena is a hegemonic party, that it will become the next or anything like that. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if it's
but that's
entirely I don't know if I don't know if it's entirely incorrect either, though, but we'll see.
I don't know, but that's well, this is a bit off topic, but I'll just respond to that. But that's sort of like typical like bourgeoisie, like liberal doctrine of of like, okay, so you have a Hugo Chavez, who I think is a democratic socialist, and I also do think Maduro is a democratic socialist, and then I would say the same thing about Daniel Ortega and so forth. But of course, to the affluent bourgeoisie and the super rich, whenever one actually takes on the oligarch, they never want. They actually don't really believe in democracy. They really do believe in plutocracy,
No.
And so, but you can say, but of course, you can't just say, "Oh, this is terrible, me having to pay more taxes to help fight the poor and so forth." So what do they have to do? They have to sell the politics of cynicism. That's the problem with Latin America is you either have the far left or you have the far right, and there's nobody in the middle. There's not this perfect middle, even though even though with a liberal democracy in which the free market is a basic tenet of that, you're always going to have grotesque levels of inequality in a place like Brazil, in a place like Mexico, or any other place which capitalism has been forced down the people's throat because of colonialism, and now this and now call it what you want, neocolonialism, call it corporatism, call it globalization, but that is like the problem, is that system. And then it's very annoying when you have like some of these liberals who aren't stupid. They know their history, but instead of just like embracing like all of these like socialist like movements, no, they have to like bitch and whine about it because their friends, most of them who are affluent, or most of them who might either be precarious middle class or just that middle class that's just about to become rich, yeah, they're going to complain about it and say stupid things like, "Oh, if Bernie Sanders becomes president, it's going to be the end of like America. AMLO is, AMLO is as totalitarian as all of the other right wing assholes before him." So I just wanted to say that I think that's So I'm curious your response on that before I ask.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I think one of the things that happened from the early 2000s onwards, when this process that the right here would call democratization, was the creation of these institutions that they say, that's liberal democratic institutions, such as the Electoral Institute here, how the Supreme Court works. There's a couple of other ones. Those are the two primary ones that we've seen since AMLO took power that these are not the checks and balances that, and actually I think the whole notion of checks and balances is a liberal democratic idea to stop democratization. And Mexico fundamentally is not, since the revolution, is not a liberal democracy. It's never been a liberal democracy, even as much as they've tried to make it that way. And there's a lot of sort of the Constitution as it exists now has the bones that came from that revolutionary thing, but has been Swiss cheese through multiple attacks on it by neoliberal governments to make it something like a liberal democratic document, to make it have these checks and balances, which, as we know, are places where powerful economic interests can put people that they need to stop the democratic process. Norma Pina, who's the head of the Supreme Court right now, was revealed just before the election to have been holding meetings with the opposition to be trying to discipline other Supreme Court judges who she felt were too warm to AMLO in their judgments. These places are places where the opposition and intellectuals and stuff like that hid and have incredible, like, the amount of money the Electoral Institute here has. It's one of the most expensive and well-funded in the world, and that's because of these crazy, but like, if you look at the balance sheets and the money that goes to the people, the sort of intellectual class that works at these places, it's beyond, it's wild. It's past CEO level in certain Western countries. And so AMLO has very clearly said that, like, these are not, they're not trying to, stop a dictatorship or do anything like that. What they want, they don't want the voice of the people to be heard. They don't want reforms that take away political power and put it in the hands of the people. Whether AMLO and whether Morena is entirely capable of doing that, I don't know. But certainly the constitutional reforms they're proposing right now, that hopefully will go through, have very incredible social elements into that, including 100% pension for workers, which is something that really doesn't exist across the world, including making sure that minimum wage, which will raise annually, always has to be above the rate of inflation, which means workers will always make more than they did the next year in real terms. These are like substantial popular things. And the reason why the right wing and the sort of intellectuals of the previous regime had to defend it on the basis of checks and balances and liberal democracy is because they can't say outright, we don't want Mexican workers to make more. We don't want people to have better lives, which is what they're proposing. So they have to say that this is authoritarianism, this guy is Trump, blah, blah, blah. But like, we talked about this before. I come from Canada. Canada is a place with an unelected Senate, which can stop the government that has been rightfully elected from putting through what it wants to put through. It has something called the Privy Council, which is made up of previous ministers from previous governments who also can put secret orders in council that you have no idea what they're doing, that can basically run the government as it wants. The Governor General, the representative of now the King, fucking King Charles, can also dissolve the government, run the government. These are considered liberal democracies that are like democratic.
And she, a disgrace that it's an indigenous person, and like that Governor General answers to the king.
Yeah. And the whole thing too.
And this is based on the wonderful model of British democracy.
No, and like, yeah, Britain, which doesn't even have a constitution, and Canada, which only has a constitution in 1982. I mean, the one thing you can say about Mexico, and I think this, I do hope beyond constitutional reform, they'll open up. So the second place candidate for leadership for the presidency, because Juan Marcelo Ebrard sort of dropped out, was Noronha, who is a senator, or was a senator from the Workers' Party here, which is, it calls itself explicitly a socialist party, is part of the coalition that just won. He said that he's going to propose, I think, that he wants to open up another constitutional sort of assembly so that Mexicans themselves can decide what their constitution is. That, to me, that is the essence of democracy, not elite little fiefdoms that can like pull the brakes when they see something that's going to attack economic power, which is what liberal democracy is made out of.
And of course, in the U.S., the Constitution comes from God, and it's infallible, so you can never reform
Which
that.
yeah, I mean that's the thing too, is that for for there's some, I don't know, for all the shit that's thrown at the like sort of pink tide and reformist governments of Latin America. Um, Really, the one thing that they proposed was a sort of peaceful expansion of popular democracy, rather than military coups, or sorry, military governments, or alternately liberal democratic facades, which are just ways of economic power and political power coming together to stop any democratization. So I think Mexico has historically and currently still, even under these conditions of private profit and capital extraction, has a lot of lessons in democracy to give to the world.
Yeah. And now, the Big Tent right wing party, their winning streak finally ended in 2000. Now, they weren't replaced by a left wing alternative. They were replaced by a rival right wing party, PAN, English, the
Yeah.
National Action Party. And so from 2000 to 2006, the president of Mexico was Vincente Fox. Now,
Yeah.
international audiences and those who don't follow Mexican or Latin American affairs will know Fox for his viral interviews, who, when responding to Donald Trump about building a border wall and Mexico has to pay for it, he has said many times, "I'm not going to pay for that fucking wall," and his popular internet recordings, hilariously mocking Trump. But it's important to remind people, especially left-leaning folks and those not politically educated to the left and people power movements, that Vincente Fox is not left-leaning. He's a right-winger, no friend to the Mexicans who, to move to the U.S. legally or illegally in search for a better life. He waged a drug war, which now, since leaving office, has expressed that pot and drug consumption shouldn't be criminalized or overly penalized and should be legalized. So talk to us about his legacy and how he more or less continued the right wing terror of pre.
So when PAN came in 2000, that was sort of what even people on the left, maybe more the middle class left, were excited about, was the possibility of sort of breaking up PRI's hold over institutions, creating new institutions like the INE and things like that. So that's when the opposition refers to democratization, blah blah blah, why it's fragile. That's the process that they're talking about. It's been revealed since then, of course, since Calderon, since everything that's happened, to be a total fraud. He said in 2006 that he was going to do everything he could to make sure AMLO didn't win. AMLO did win that election. And then afterwards, he said he was upset he didn't do more. Recently, he's been on Twitter. He was a big supporter of Galvez, the right-wing opposition candidate, but spouting just like crazy anti-Semitic stuff. Xochitl Galvez, she's
Wait,
the
wait.
only.
Vincente Fox, you mean?
Yeah, Vicente Fox. He's got this Twitter account where he types in all caps. I mean, he's the, for somebody who's presented as the anti-Trump, he's very Trumpian, including like, uh Xochitl Galvez is the only real Christian. This Claudia Sheinbaum is a Bulgarian, a Jew. Like, what's she doing? Like crazy anti-Semitic stuff. He stopped tweeting for a while after he apologized, and then he came back and just unleashed a bunch of very similar stuff. So he's crazed. He's also said, he deserves a pension as the former president. AMLO got rid of the presidential pension, which was very substantial. He deserves it, but older Mexicans, working Mexicans, poor Mexicans, they do not. It makes them lazy. They should keep on working. I mean, there's crazy stuff that, just looking at the opposition, what they say here in Mexico, and which is gatekept by liberal media in the United States, Canada, and Europe, would not be acceptable there, right? Like their idea is that if you're poor and you're working, you have to keep on working till you die. And that the idea that there's a pension for you is ridiculous, unless you've been, unless you're a corporate executive or a former politician, then you should have a massive pension. It's like, it's wildly anti-democratic. Oh, these people don't know how to read, so we can't trust them with the education system is such a mess. They've said all these sort of things. It's like, you guys were in power for decades. What you're saying is that you created this, but then also now you can't trust these people because you've kept them in an underdeveloped and uneducated situation. So there's nothing democratic or idealistic or anything good about people like Vicente Fox. They're like racist, classist, anti-democratic freaks. And I think even himself, I think technically you're supposed to be born within Mexico. There's something in the Constitution that he had to change based on your lineage because he's from a German background to in order to run for the presidency. So he changed that himself, but now he wants to like assign it because he doesn't, he's not very unsure. This Jew, why is this Jew running for the presidency when he himself had to change it to run? So they're hypocrites, they're racists, I mean, it just shows how I've lived in Canada, I've lived in the United States, or sorry, in Mexico, both born in the United States. It's incredible how little American media, how derelict in their duty they are in providing just basic facts for Americans to know about their neighbors and what's politically happening. I'm not talking about like a leftist analysis, something. I'm talking about just basic things that they get incredibly wrong. And one of them is that Vicente Fox is somehow some anti-Trump figure. And that goes, I mean, he could be anti-Trump personally, but his politics are very, very, very similar.
Well, I thought it was very interesting. A quick follow up on that before I ask about his successor. I just thought it was like, yes, like it's funny how he says like I'm not going to pay for the fucking wall, blah 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 blah, so, and so forth. But I always thought it was, but I just thought it was strange how viral like that went. So you had like you had like the Mexican like diaspora and the Latinx like diaspora rallying Vicente Fox. It's like okay, guys, hold up. First of all, if there is a migrant crisis, if there are people illegally, well, forget the term legal or illegal. If there are people from Mexico and other parts of Central America who are fleeing extreme poverty or fleeing the violence of drug wars or political repression, right wing terrorism, and so forth, it's because people like Vicente Fox allow American corporations to exploit their people. They allow the United States to prop up the reactionary elites, of which Vincente Fox is part of it. That's why That's why you have people who go who do these horrific, harrowing, journeys in search of a I call it a BS life of a better living and so forth, the American dream or the Canadian dream and so forth. But yeah,
so
Vicente Fox is no. But yeah, Vicente Fox is no. No, he's not left leaning. I wouldn't even call him a liberal. I mean, but yeah, like economic liberalism. Yeah, he doesn't believe in that. But he's not even like a very socially liberal person. So again, like it is crazy, but it is crazy how that just gets completely omitted in corporate news outlets.
I think I'd say that the Mexican diaspora within the United States is also, there's a big class divide. And I think that probably more of the people who presented Vicente Fox as an anti-Trump figure would be a television station like Univision, which now is making roads in with Trump but before that, I mean, is very anti-AMLO. And is anti-AMLO also because he stopped giving them public money. And so if you can see so I'd say the majority of the Mexican diaspora, at least as it's evidenced in how they operate politically in the United States in terms of their voting and organizing, is way to the left sometimes of even the Mexican population. Noroña and the PT, for example, which are a minor socialist party here, are very, very popular in the United States among voters. And that's also one of the reasons why you can see, you watch videos from yesterday, in Chicago, I think there was something like only like 3,000 ballots available for voting at the consulate, which in Chicago is there's a lot more than 3,000 Mexicans in Chicago. And that's because the INE, which represents the old political parties, the right-wing opposition, does not want migrant Mexicans in the United States to vote, because that is a massive amount of votes for the left, for Morena, for the PT.
Actually,
So I think that, yeah.
let me interrupt you there because we're definitely because I actually do have a question about like media coverage and the diaspora. To, uh, to answer this question, which is, so at his time in office, no, after his time in office, you know, so after Vincente Fox came Felipe Calderon, part of the same party. So from December 2006 to November 2012, you had Felipe Calderon, and then Pre returned to power, and then Pre came back to power under a young but bootlicker for aggressive capitalist and Western imperial interests, Enrique Pena Nieto. But
Yeah.
instead of talking about all of their legacies and the assaults on the working class and the destitute, now talk to us about the rise of AMLO, his legacy, what gets overlooked about his major gains, however small or big. Talk to us about the mass right-wing media opposition to him domestically, his relations between the corporate state media, how the U.S. media has covered him, and side notes before Jay answers this question, but this is an important side note. When AMLO got inaugurated, John Ackerman, brilliant journalist, I often saw him on the Real News and on Moderate Rebels. He said the following to Max Blumenthal, which to give people an understanding of how he approaches politics and his opponents. So John Ackerman said the following: that he is a chess player, not a football player or a wrestler.
So I think, okay, a good example of how that might have worked out is that the opposition, when they were picking their presidential candidate, there was, I think, 3 or 4 potential, probably real potentials to be the candidate. And one of them, probably the strongest in my mind, and that people think now, was a woman from PRI called Beatriz Paredes, who was sort of maybe a classic priest with some elements of social democratic stuff. She's well thought of, let's say, in like nationally, and probably if they had allowed the militancy of these parties to vote, she would have been that. They didn't. The weekend that they were supposed to vote on who was going to be their opposition candidate for all these parties, they pulled the plug and they decided Xochitl Galvez was going to be the candidate. Xochitl Galvez is a long time politician. She's from the state of Hidalgo, from a place called Tepatepec, which is a site of there's a teachers college there. That's one of the major sort of places where they train a lot of teachers. Our parents were teachers. That teaching college, I have friends there I've visited, is actually really interesting because they were trying to shut it down in the 2000s under a neoliberal government. It was occupied by a very strong, there's a very, like, teachers in Mexico are generally Marxist to Maoist to anarchist. So they had an occupation there. They ended up wanting, they had to fight the police, fight the army, and now you go there and there's murals of Stalin and Che Guevara and Lenin everywhere on the campus. Anyway, so she came from that. It's very disputed whether her family was poor or whether they were kind of like middle class at the time when a teaching salary did mean something. She was in Vicente Fox's administration as an indigenous representative. She basically, she's been close to the seat of power and not very distinguished by anything except her ability to get contracts for her ridiculous businesses and the lies that she's made up about her background. So why was she picked? Why was she picked? And this gets back to the chess player thing, which I think even Ackerman would agree with, was that as they were sort of discussing last year, the opposition, about who was going to be the candidate, AMLO started talking about her, not any of the other candidates, and talking about her. And because she has this reputation as, the right-wing opposition is so dumb and so classist and racist, they're like, oh, she's kind of like, she swears, she talks kind of like commonly, so she must be another AMLO. And that's why AMLO's talking about her, because he's scared. So essentially the thinking is that AMLO, through his ability with the morning press conferences to sort of distinguish, to set the agenda for political discussion, basically was like, I know who this person is, and I know that she is going to like destroy everything. And so if I focus on her, they'll pick her because they'll think I'm scared of her, which is what they did. And they forced it on the militancy against Beatriz Paredes, who was definitely a way better candidate and probably would have lost too, but would have made a real show of it. So I think that's one of the things when it gets to him being a chess player. But AMLO himself, he's from Tabasco. He's from the South. He grew up in a sort of like lower middle class family. He was a member of the PRI since the 70s. I'd say the left current of the PRI, which is how he ended up in the PRD. His background is indigenous and union organizing. I think he is a man of the left, I'd say. I don't think that he's explicitly a socialist, but I think there's a lot that he knows, having studied it, and knows about the left that he's enacting, including the controversial militarization, and basically how he's going about changing things. And he references in last year, in the 50th anniversary of the coup, in Chile. He went down. He rarely leaves the country, but left the country for that. And he said, when I was studying at UNAM, the major university here, the public university, one of the things that really impressed upon me politically was Lenin's State and Revolution. So he's aware of that, and I think that also gets a clue to like what he's doing with the military and the militarization of society, which is that he knows that Allende did not deal with the military, and so the military dealt with him. And so whether you like it or not, what he's doing with the military, putting it in charge of a lot of civil infrastructure projects, is a way of keeping a military that is connected to the US imperialism, that is, highly dangerous. He's keeping it busy. And the day before the election, one thing that happened was that there was a Twitter account by the head of Sedena, which is sort of the national defense ministry here. His Twitter account had been taken over. He ended it a couple years ago, but the opposition took it over and put out this statement that basically said, like, there's going to be a coup, like, because they wanted to it. But I think that if AMLO hadn't done what he's done with the military, i.e. keeping it busy, that it's probably very realistic that there would have been a coup. So in a lot of ways, AMLO is not, he doesn't come right out and say, we've got to keep the military busy or they're going to overthrow me. He says, the military is an integral part of Mexican life. It has a long, proud history of the defender of our people, and it's going to help build things for the people, et cetera, et cetera. So he's not coming right out and saying, like, we've got to keep the military busy, but that's obviously what he's doing. So I think that's one element of his personality that comes out in the political decisions that he's made.
That's quite fascinating. And now, can you explain to me? Actually, wait. Let me get. That's a layer question. Okay, so does AMLO back then and now, does he have the support of the Mexican diaspora, those who share dual nationalities with the U.S. and Mexico, and the working class and even middle and upper class illegal immigrants? And if the answer is no, why not? And you already and talk to us more about how Univision, Telemundo, the big corporate Spanish-speaking news outlet based in Miami, it covers Latin American news. How has Jorge Ramos and that outlet been covering AMLO? And if it's negative, why, given their pro illegal alien stance?
So Jorge Ramos has been down here a couple of times recently for the Mañaneras, and AMLO has, basically done kind of a softer version of what Maduro said, which is like, you're no journal. I mean, there was a famous interview with Jorge Ramos and Maduro where Maduro is like, you're no journalist, this. And that's what AMLO has done.
Trash, Jorge.
Yeah. Which AMLO has done in a lot softer way. And a lot of that comes from Univision, which as I mentioned before, and domestic sort of, here we have TV Azteca, Televisa, these sort of large networks, which really benefited from massive public subsidies before and no longer do. So that's culturally, that hostility towards AMLO would be there just because of what Univision is, and it's a corporate entity, but also because they lost a lot of money when AMLO was like, okay, you don't get any of these public subsidies anymore. So that's the basis of it. And And once again, I think there is a dual. I mean, Univision needs to have, just based on its audience, needs to have a more progressive viewpoint towards illegal migration, towards migration, let's say, not illegal. But I think that's also because, you know, that's the sort of democratic view of migration, which is that, yeah, we need these people to come to our country so we can exploit them. And if they come illegally, that's great too. We can exploit them, and maybe some of them will get a path to citizenship, but most of them won't. So I think that's sort of the Univision Telemundo approach.
Well, I find well, okay, well, I find that fascinating. Well, I find that fascinating because you would because well because this is because I'm a leftist, but I just thought like you would think that like people who are pro pro immigrants, and yes, if they come here illegally, let's give them a path to citizenship. So you would think, well, here comes AMLO, here's a social democrat who's going to give those poor people a raise in the minimum wage and so forth. So I don't know, like I would just say like you would be like supportive of that, like that's your fellow countrymen, like these people, and yet and yet, as you say, they've actually been hostile to
Yeah.
AMLO. So,
Yeah, it's a class thing. These people are from an upper middle class that is like very, it's a very Latin American societies still are very unequal. These people fashion themselves as sort of progressive liberals. They are not. I mean, there's a whole other issue now too, which comes to the leftist sort of like external left coverage of AMLO, which is there's plenty of, let's say, whitezican leftist progressive types, people who grew up in neighborhoods like Polanco or Lomas, who come from very rich, racist, classist families, but who are, doing their PhD in environmental studies or political economy or geography or something like that, and recycle a leftist, let's say, left critique of AMLO, which has merit, but also writes out the whole notion of imperialism. I think the best thing, and probably we talked about this before, the best thing people can do on that sort of like greenwashing or the green imperialism is to read Max Eil's book, A People's Green New Deal, which talks about
mhm.
like that's fundamentally, I think that Mexico does want to go to a green economy. However, it has to deal with the reality, which is that handing over all of your renewable energies, as the previous governments did, to private interests on the backbone of the public system is terrible, and it hasn't produced results. There's a big wind energy program in Oaxaca. The indigenous groups there were like, this is terrible. This is like, it's ruining the land around us. And it's worse than oil, because at least with oil, the money, some of the money comes back to our communities. But with wind energy, it just goes to Spain. And that's the experience that people had here. So there's a lot of
Wow.
people abroad who are taking these left and environmental critiques and not seeing that if Mexico wants to socially develop, especially so close to the United States, it needs energy sovereignty. That means they're going to unfortunately have to use the vast oil reserves that they have. That means that there's going to be mega projects and development that happens that is not maybe the best. I don't think the train Maya is a terrible, Maya train is a terrible example. It's certainly better to have passenger rail than it is to have freeways everywhere. And that's something that they're expanding. That the development that happens is conditioned by the fact that they live in a capitalist and imperialist economy, and that you're going to have to do some of these things that are unsavory. Or I don't know what the alternative that they're really, but they're not proposing an alternative. They're making a critique because and that critique, while it seems left and based on sort of environmental ideas, is fundamentally, the idea is that the global south should remain undeveloped and it should remain pristine and pure. And also, what are these brown people getting all uppity about? Which is the real background, is that these people's class ideas, even with their leftist education and pronouncements, is that they do not like the fact that the working class here is exercising at least a bit of political power for its own benefit. And it's been shown the purchasing power of the vast majority of Mexicans who are poor and workers is a lot better and a lot higher now than before 2018. And who has suffered, not suffered, but who's taken a hit is the upper class. And so they hate that. And that's where they come from. And so they put these left sort of critiques out that do not deal with imperialism or the problem of underdevelopment, which Mexico has.
That is fascinating. And I've had to switch my questions around because I think this is a perfect follow-up question to that, which is, how has Western-based left-leaning media, from the indie world to the NGO world to international broadcasts like Al Jazeera, TRT, Press TV, been on AMLO's efforts and struggles to advance his socialist agenda in Mexico? And have you been surprised by some of the Western left media's negative assessments of AMLO, downplaying the major gains or even the great small gains?
Yeah.
The most notable that comes to mind is, and apologies to my comrades at the World Socialist website, but the most notable example that comes to mind is the World Socialist website's Eric London. I believe I showed you. I showed you and a member of Orinoco Tribune from Mexico. I showed you a copy of Eric London's coverage of AMLO's press conference with Trump, and gonna put that in the show notes. But your response, just your response in general.
So I think mostly and primarily why I got involved with the Mexico Solidarity Project was, it's the project that we do right now, currently mexicosolidarity.com, is a media project devoted to just exposing and translating left analysis and news and coverage that's happening here into English, because it was mostly ignorance. Like, mostly people on the left didn't write about AMLO at all. It wasn't even considered part of the left in a way that I remember the Syriza like wildness or the stuff about Jeremy Corbyn or things like that, how much ink was spilt over that. Whereas for Mexico, mostly nothing, except stuff coming out of sort of the left connected to the Zapatistas and that sort of network of people, which is also kind of small and doesn't really make it into, let's say, the larger left outlets. So there wasn't really anything.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah, sorry to interrupt. But then I have to ask this. I still find that quite surprising, given John Ackerman, when he was first interviewed by the Real News Network about AMLO and his running for the Mexican presidency. AMLO said that that he's like Bernie Sanders, he's like Jeremy Corbyn. So you would have thought, like, the Western left, which was really obsessed with the Sanders campaign and the Jeremy Corbyn projects, and you even mentioned Syriza, that they would like AMLO because he's a soft social democratic reformer.
So yeah, and I think it's racism and Eurocentrism that, like, right on the, like, people just don't know the fucking DSA and people like that. I mean, they're here now as election observers, and we've done a couple of projects with them and some other groups. Jose Luis Granado Sea has done a speaking tour and stuff, and it was like people were like, "Oh, that's what's happening in Mexico." I mean, which is it's Eurocentrism and it's racism, and it's not always like thought of that way, but so much of Mexico was just ignored because of it. So yeah, it was ignorance, and the coverage that was done was from a harder left perspective, more Zapatista solidarity networks, which are very, like, have very, very valid critics. I'm not critiques. I'm not denying that. But let's say the sort of Nation, the Real News Network, those kind of things, very sparse coverage for something that is so substantive and so transformational. I would say, having been to Greece during the Syriza period and seeing the immiseration and hideousness and the betrayal of Greek working people and just Greek people in general by Syriza, I mean, to compare like what happened in AMLO with a pandemic, mind you, it's night and day. This is like, I think it's one of the most successful reformist governments in decades. And again, there's very specific reasons and contradictions for that, but that's the reality, and it's a shame that people haven't seen it. I think the other thing too is that, look, this is, I'm not, I don't know if there, I don't think there is a peaceful path to socialism or anything like that in imperialist countries. I do think that reformist governments can do a lot when they're facing imperialism, and I think that Mexico is a country that, well, it has its own highly developed sector of capital here, is subject to imperialism. So I think that those possibilities that reformist governments have in the global South don't necessarily exist in the global North. However, I think it's funny that the reformist currents in the global North haven't looked at Mexico, because this is like, for, I mean, if you're in the United States and you're really upset there's a duopoly, there's two parties running stuff. Look, one party ran everything here for 70 fucking years. And the people, if you think the United States is going to be under fascism under Trump, what Mexican workers, what the Mexican left, what the Mexican peasants experienced in Mexico was, if you think that's fascism, what Trump is proposing, that's what they experienced here. The political violence, the murders, the massacres, everything that happened, the exploitation is just on a, like, unimaginable. And through that, they started, first of all, they tried to go through the PRI to make the left come back again. That didn't work. So they tried to work within the existing party. They created a second party, the PRD. That didn't work. Elections were stolen from them. And then they created a third party, Morena. So to see people like the DSA who are still trapped in supporting Democrats, I mean, like, you've got a lot to learn. And that might mean it's going to take 30 years, but you should start it, and you shouldn't be like, there's a path through through some positive changes through the Democrats.
And who even knows if we have 30 years left on this dying planet? But then
Yeah.
but then what's your response? We don't, and let's not go, let's not spend too much time on it. But what was your response to the critique of Eric London of the World Socialist website, and his characterization of AMLO?
I'm going through the memory. Was it about labor reform stuff, or what, could you
It
briefly
was like a
summarize?
it was like a press
Oh,
conference where apparently, like, AMLO was kind of like propping up Donald Trump, even though Donald Trump
oh,
was like
so
insulting,
that's,
like.
yeah, this is the thing. I mean, this is even Scheinbaum's, like, they've said repeatedly, and you talk to people here, and they're like, people would say Mexico's relationship, the working class people would say Mexico's relationship with the United States was better under Trump. That even the horrible stuff he did, I mean, look, Biden's just done the same but worse, right? And but that there's a delicate balance, right? They can't pick a fight with the United States all the time. Although AMLO has, the Conference of the Americas where Cuba wasn't invited. He's like, I'm not going, we're not going, we're not doing that. There's many instances where he's bucked US imperialism on things. But generally he used to this, I don't think is entirely true, but this sort of thing based on the Estrada Doctrine here, which is sort of like a neutrality, and that comes to like, oh, well, if the Americans elect Trump or they elect Biden, we'll work with whoever because they have to. And I think that's like, that's the thing is it's a reformist government. They're making the changes they can under the conditions that they can. I think they could do more, but I think that it's impressive what they've been able to do. And so some of that means you can't pick a fight with Trump or Biden all the time about certain things. And yet there's times that he's done it. And also I think this man does a 2 hour, 2.5 hour press conference every day. To take one press conference as indicative of everything is very weird. It's not, because unlike the American president who comes out once every 3 months when he's not tripping or down the stairs or whatever, or thinking that Sisi is the president of Mexico, AMLO does it all the time. So you probably can find whatever you want within that. I'm sure you can edit anything in there, but I think fundamentally, no, he's not. There's the it's not and has not been a revolutionary situation in Mexico for a long time. So picking a fight with US imperialism right now is not something that also Mexicans themselves want. a major fight anyways. On certain little battles and skirmishes, people are very happy about it. And some of that comes down to things that have already been fought for before, like energy sovereignty, the importance of Pemex and state oil.
And let's talk about the Mexican. Let's talk about the Mexican diaspora again,
Mm.
which I think is I always find this subject a very fascinating subject. So I wanted to ask. Oh, wait, where is it? Where is it? Yes, yes. So let me ask you this question again, which is oh, sorry, getting lost. Okay, yeah, here it is. So AMLO back then and now, does he have the support of the Mexican diaspora and those who share dual nationalities? And which class dynamic supports him? Like, does the working class support him, but does the middle class and even upper class illegal immigrants support him? And if the answer is no, why? And yeah, actually ask that question, and I have and I got a
Sure.
follow-up question.
So diaspora wise, I think the majority of the diaspora is working class and supports Morena or the Workers' Party. And obviously there's a smaller diaspora, much more influential with a lot more money that does not and hates Morena. And those people are still also the people who work at the consulates, the people who work in the foreign affairs ministry. When I first moved down here, I met a woman who was staying in the same hotel as me. She worked for foreign affairs. She had been in uh, there for like 20 years or something like that. And she was back home because she was being moved somewhere else to another embassy in China. And she was, because I'm white, she's was felt fairly confident that I also would be a retrograde reactionary and wanted to tell me all about how AMLO was Hugo Chavez. And actually, no, he's not Hugo Chavez. He's Joseph Stalin. And I was like, oh, I mean, I wish, but tell me more about all this. And basically, a lot of it comes down to he put through in the pandemic, he put through a thing called Republican austerity, which is very different than neoliberal austerity. Basically, he's trying to get rid of the privileges of the bureaucrats and people here. They make a ton of money, are sort of a class above other people. And so they fucking hate him for it. And so a lot of the sort of Mexicans abroad are either like work with transnational corporations who also hate them, or they work with in a Mexican bureaucratic function, which means their wages and their massive benefits are being cut. So they hate them for that. So that's sort of the
So
diaspora,
they
and
hate
that's my reading of the diaspora.
so they hate his social so the rich that
Yeah,
is the rich the rich Mexican diasporas hate him
yeah.
for his socialism for the poor and his capitalism for the rich.
Yeah, and I mean I guess that's another. I mean, I didn't mention this before too. This is another thing, which is why the project that they're pursuing here as a national development reformist project, smart elements of capital here get it and understand like, oh, okay, you've got a lot of people in Mexico. If if you're a regular capitalist who lives off the misery and exploitation of others rather than totally corrupt and live off of the exploitation misery of others plus steal from the public purse, if you're the first one of those, this is a good moment because all of a sudden he's taking the money that used to go to these, let's say, corrupt enterprises and giving it to the poorest. And when the poorest have money, this is just basic Keynesian economics, they're going to spend it. So he's making a market here. So smart capitalists look at this and say, this is great because the wages are still lower than the United States. You're still able to manufacture, you're still able to make an immense fucking profit. They're actually now lower than China. China's manufacturing is a lot more expensive, also across, away from the American market. So smart capitalists here see the social stuff that he's doing as just being very good for now. That has a certain timeline to it as well, right? It's not they wouldn't never want to see wages go or purchasing power going higher than the United States. I mean, but the people who for so long lived off of government contracts, which are just crazy here. I mean, this is going back to the opposition candidate, Xochitl Galvez, who lost. She runs this fucking ridiculous company. It's like a smart buildings company. Basically, she sells smart, Google Home kind of packages to big big skyscrapers and developers and things like that. Like she doesn't do anything. She's not a real engineer. But that's how she made her money. And she has all of these contracts. And even when it was pointed out in one of the second debate by Claudia Sheinbaum that she's doing this, she didn't even think of it as corruption. She's like, oh, this is just, you hate me for being a good business person. You're not a business, but you're using, like, this is a conflict of interest. You're using your position to get contracts. But to her, she just thinks that's good business. So there is a section of capital and of the middle class and upper class here in Mexico that are like, oh, if we just act like normal capitalists and yes, live off the misery of others, but just don't take money from the public purse, we're going to do very well. And that's what's been happening. And so there's another thing too. The minimum wage increases, there's businesses that hate it, but also if you think about it, if it hits every business the same, that's a cost that your competitors and that you both have to bear, and that's just going to make more money for the domestic market here. And more money to the domestic market means poor and working people, who are the majority of this country, are going to spend more of your money. So that's where we're at, and that's the project.
And then the Mexican diaspora, those those who have dual nationalities, those who are in the country illegally, from
Yeah.
a working class and lower middle class background. I prefer to call them the precarious middle class, who will easily
Yeah.
become, poor working class, like, once their overpriced college days are done. So are they mostly supportive of AMLO, but of course, super rich and the affluence and whatnot, hostile towards AMLO?
Yeah, I mean the voting shows that. That's where they vote Morena, they vote Pete, the diaspora. And I mean, I think we still have to get the results. But yeah, that's it. Like I lived in Toronto before here, and now I live in an area of the city. It's funny because there's diaspora representatives too, right? Like you vote for people here. So the representative from where I'm living actually lives in Toronto, and he's from Morena, and he's more on the left of Morena. Like he's a like comes from a communist background, is in Morena, and those are the types of diaspora politicians who are elected. So and as I mentioned before, the popularity of Noronha, who is from the Workers' Party, which is an avowedly socialist party, he's very, very popular in the United States. When Claudia Sheinbaum went to the United States, she would always bring him because more diaspora people who tend not to migrate from Mexico City, but from rural areas, know him than they knew her, politically anyways, because she was the head of government here in Mexico City, but he was a nationally known figure, and especially known for his outright attacks and on Calderon and stuff, and bravery against that. So yeah, the diaspora is definitely more left.
So is that still the? Can you say that that's the same for Chicanos, those those Mexican immigrants, legal or otherwise, who aren't bilingual and only speak only speak English? Are most of them from the working class and the precarious middle class still
Yeah.
very supportive of AMLO?
Yeah. When she went to the United States, she made a couple stops. One of them was in New York, to speak to a group of Mexicans. It was Columbia University kids who were very rich. That's a very expensive school for Mexicans to go to. And the protest outside was Mexican working class people. She was hounded by protests. And that one, she decided to like use a body double because she didn't want to, face the people that apparently she said supported her, to go around the back. In a small town in New York too, she was like, there was a big protest against her there. She was not well received by the Mexican diaspora during her American trip.
This is Calderon's wife.
No. This is Galvez. This is the candidate, Xochitl Galvez, who's just the candidate who lost for the
Okay,
opposition.
okay, okay, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks for that clarification.
Yeah.
Then I have to ask. Then I have to ask this question, which is explain to me this. Now, how is it? Mexicans who leave Mexico, whether they get into the U.S. the harrowing illegal way or the legal way, many of these people know that the U.S. and Canada, but primarily the U.S., is the root of all evil in Mexico. Hence why they've had to flee and search for a supposedly better life in the U.S., minus no single payer health care and no social security if you're illegal. So why do these people, they could be Chicanos, they could be those who are bilingual, with all the knowledge they know of the U.S. being an evil
Yeah.
empire,
Why do they go?
remain hostile. Well, not that. Why do they remain hostile to Venezuela under Chavez and Maduro, Nicaragua under Daniel
Yeah.
Ortega, be in the 80s or the 2010s, are hostile to Cuba, even though Fidel Castro, whatever criticisms you want to make on his domestic agenda, has been a force for good in the world, not least in Latin America, unlike the U.S., EU, NATO, Canada, Pan-Europeanism. So I'm curious your response on that. Why some of those people of a background are hostile to AMLO and the broad left, even though AMLO is, according to John Ackerman, very much a true center leftist, like Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn.
I'm definitely no expert on the Latin American diaspora or anything like that, and the experience I have with it is probably self-selectedly very to the left and communist. I can say, but I can talk about, I guess, the media representation within Mexico of left governments too. And while AMLO and to an extent Claudia and Morena itself remains a very important point for the left. There's always people coming here. I saw Evo Morales yesterday. He's here as an international election observer. Obviously, his life was saved because he was able to get to Mexico. Historically, Mexico has been important for the left. Even under pre-governments, there was a weird sort of left internationalism, which allowed people to come here to exile. So, but I would say there's two things. The corporate media here is incredibly hostile to Venezuela and Cuba. And the references already have been, as long as AMLO has been a candidate, have been that he's going to turn it into Cuba and Venezuela. So there's that hostility that is obviously has an effect on the working class as seeing this. But I also think that it takes a while for people to develop a political consciousness that expands to internationalism. And I think right now that exists within the Mexican, let's say, cultural left producers that I know within Morena, who are not, from the left before, like not communists or socialists, but are just generally for Morena, that their project is saying, no, we're not going to turn to Cuba or Venezuela. It's not questioning what has happened. It is happening in Cuba and Venezuela, why Cuba's under sanctions, why Venezuela's under sanctions. So that's that deepening of consciousness, at least in the sort of media sphere of the left here, has to happen. In Nicaragua, it's also very weird here. I'm involved in some Nicaragua solidarity stuff. There's an outright hostility towards Nicaragua, even on some circles of a better left here. I think that's because of internal disagreements with the Sandinistas and stuff that happened over the years. I don't think that's necessarily because they're looking at, the things that Nicaragua has done. It's a very safe country, even though it's poor. It provides for a lot of things. It's managed to do a development that privileges rural development, that isn't just urban based. There's a lot that Mexicans could learn from Nicaragua. I think that anyone can learn from Nicaragua. I don't think that's reflected in the media. So I think there's still this difficulty that this is a government that is supported by the left, that is doing a developmental project, but that can't explicitly be, and probably won't be, we're socialists, we're doing what Cuba did here, we're learning from Nicaragua, we're learning from Venezuela, because the consciousness of the supporters isn't there. The corporate media attack might be there. That frustrates me as well. But I mean, I'm a guest here in this country. I don't see everything either. But I think that's sort of my impression. So, but I would say that again, how the government actually acts in terms of like demanding that the sanctions end on Cuba and Venezuela, offering a space for the Venezuelan government and opposition to meet to try to work things out in order to reduce sanctions, working the Cuban medical doctor program. I was in Cuba just after the big explosion at the refinery in Matanzas. Mexico was one of the first to support them directly with oil, to say, here's oil. They're doing that. There's a lot of really direct, serious, if this, if everybody here within Morena and with the left isn't like rah, rah, rah Cuba all the time, the actions of the Mexican government are showing immense solidarity, especially to the Cuban people.
But yeah, it's quite fascinating. And
Yeah.
has AMLO been able to advance much needed socialist agenda, socialist reforms, because he does have uh because his party does have like a lot of seats in like the Mexican, I don't know if we call it the Senate or like the Parliament, because I know
Yeah.
Lula didn't have that. Lula and Dilma
So,
never had a majority in their Congress, hence why they had to often make
yeah.
compromises with the with the broad right wing opposition.
No, so it's the Chamber of Deputies and the Senate here, the Congress and Senate. And so up until this election, actually now it looks like they will have a super majority, but they didn't. They had to like deal with members of the PRI or the other sort of neoliberal pseudo-progressive party, the Citizens Movement, to get things passed. And they did it. And they also did it because those somebody was saying this, and I think it's actually true. That's there's the agenda and the thinking that's being set right now in the general populace is conscious. It's not socialist necessarily, but it's conscious of like the experience of working people and the needs of working people. And so the opposition was not opposition intellectuals, and they speak to themselves, were racist and classist and terrible. When they tried to speak to people whose votes they want, they had to pretend to be progressive. So they had to show it sometimes by voting along with the government. So the government has never been able to pass things because AMLO has the power and he's going to push it through, or Morena has the power. But it looks like now they will, having been able to achieve a lot even with working with the opposition. Now it looks like they will have a supermajority, which means they'll be able to do constitutional reforms that are very progressive and change the judiciary, things like that. So, but no, they've never been able to push their agenda through. It's always required politicking and working with members of the opposition or making the case for it publicly and then having the opposition sort of go along with it because they don't want to be seen to not support something progressive.
All this, and AMLO's a chess player, and all this while
Yeah.
also having a very hostile corporate media. But what
Yeah.
about the state? But talk to me about the state media in Mexico, because all of Latin America has a state media. Much of the time, though, all of Latin America has been governed by the far right Democrats and far right juntas.
Yeah. So
so,
there's
so
not
so 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 how has AMLO's so how has the Mexican state media been to AMLO compared to previous Mexican
so
media?
the media question is really interesting because there's not a large, as far as I know, a large public broadcaster that is national. There is a Mexico City government funded channel called Channel 14, which has a lot of like left wing representation. There's an UNAM television, which John Ackerman does a show on, which is technically public. Um, so a lot of the media, televised broadcast media, is just corporate, and that's also because they privatized a lot of it too. So a lot of what would have been public before is now private. So the media struggle or fight has been more outside the broadcast media, and it's been through social media, through little producers. TikTok is very popular here, sharing stuff through WhatsApp. The other big thing is La Jornada, which is a left-wing daily newspaper, which has a circulation of about, I guess, 350,000. So not big, but it's a daily newspaper. It also has editions and a website that are localized. So that's sort of considered like the voice of the left, which is within Morena, but also can be critical of Morena. So there's not like Telesur, like the Mexican government does not fund Telesur, for example, even though there's people here from Telesur, but they do not fund it. So they're not involved in that project. I don't know why. I think maybe it is not wanting to be seen too connected to Venezuela or something like that.
Yeah,
But that's also been a criticism, Morena, too, that they haven't put money into a public outlet. And so, but then again, they've had the Mañaneras, they've had the morning press conferences that AMLO does. That's how they're able to like set their agenda. But that also depends on AMLO's personality. Is that something Claudia is going to replicate? We don't know. Um, it would be better had they thought of ways to sort of create a public outlet. But again, there's internet stuff. There's a lot that's going on. There's a lot of different sort of voices, which I think is interesting too. So while there's not a big public broadcaster with a lot of money pushing a lot of stuff out, there are a lot of people involved in sort of like counter corporate discourse here.
I find that fascinating. And very quick follow up before I get to the last question is was AMLO and Claudia was AMLO able to get elected despite a very hostile corporate media, and was he able to get very reelected afterwards as well as as well as Claudia?
Well, I mean, so technically he was elected in 2006 and probably in 2012. For sure in 2006, they destroyed the ballots. They didn't want people to see. So I think that experience, that keep on like pushing, basically they had to create their own media, they had to create their own structures. The social movement sort of development into a party was what they used to bang on the door and get in there. And also there's, I don't know, this can be a little conspiratorial and I'm not totally up on it, but there was thinking that Peña Nieto, when he ended his term, was like wildly unpopular, like 4% approval or something like that. And there is thinking that uh that basically the PAN was conspiring to toss him out, and that they wanted Calderon's wife to get in, and so that it wasn't just he was very unpopular, but also that the right was working to like undermine him as well, and that when Ayotzinapa, the murder of the 43 normalista students happened, that was a crisis for the PAN as well, and so that sort of like created a big opening for Morena to push through. I don't know if that's entirely true or what, but whatever happened was that it was a long process from 2006, even before, let's say 1988, for the left to get in, and that it did it against corporate media, but it did it because also like Mexicans, here they work incredible hours, 6 days a week. It's not a 40-hour work week here, right? So yeah, broadcast media, corporate media can have an effect, but as social media comes, people are more likely to watch clips or these things from WhatsApp groups or TikTok than to, sit down at 6 o'clock and watch the news or a talk policy thing or something like that. They're going to get their news in some other way. So I think that helped as well too with dealing with a hostile corporate media.
Well, here's hoping. I find that incredible, and I think and again we actually can learn a lot from the Mexicans, because here's a population which has the same kind of corporate media we have, except maybe far right media on steroids, and yet they don't take their bullshit. And they still and their idea of a protest vote is AMLO and Claudia. So here's hoping Claudia will not be a traitor like Lenin Moreno, and will continue on with some of these major gains that AMLO has had, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah,
All right.
definitely.
Jay, I know you have to go soon, but before I let you go, we usually end. Before we end the show, we usually end the show for first time guests, but also long time returning champions, with the questionnaire done by Marcel Proust, later popular and sadly recently departed French broadcaster Bernard Pivot, later my hero, the late great James Lipton of Inside the Actors Studio. Jay, it's your turn to do the questionnaire. What is your favorite words?
Favorite words? One word or two words?
Yeah. Favorite word, one word.
One word. Socialism. There.
Okay. What is your least favorite word?
Imperialism.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, emotionally, or psychologically?
Oh, that's a good question. Um, Sort of a joyful, jubilant spirit in things, whether it's music or art or politics. That's also critical, and maybe a little bit bitter sometimes too. I
Okay.
don't know, that sort of mixture.
Fantastic. Then what turns you off then?
Um, Really depends on the day. I don't know. Lots of stuff. Yeah. I get worked up about a lot of stuff, obviously, but I think uncritical political analysis, I think, is bad. And I mean, that I've done it myself too. So I hate it myself and I hate it in others, but
Especially especially when it comes from a left perspective, I imagine. Then,
yeah.
what is your favorite curse word? And it could be in any language.
Oh, tabernacle. There we go. Quebecois, good Quebecois Catholic curse word. I was hoping that there would be some Mexican Spanish ones, but not as developed as the Quebecois ones.
Then, what siren noise do you love? Followed by what siren noise do you dislike?
What? Sorry, what was the?
What sound or noise do you love? And then
Oh,
what sound or noise do you dislike?
okay. So where I live in Mexico City, I think throughout Mexico City is a very, very loud place. So so let's noise that I love. There's a truck that goes around with a recording of a like teenage girl or something from the 1980s or 1990s. Basically, it's a truck that picks up mattresses, scrap metal, and things like that. And it's probably the most famous sound in Mexico because this one recording is played by all of these trucks, and these trucks are going throughout the neighborhoods playing it. It's very, very noticeable. So that's one of my favorite sounds. One of my least favorite sounds
Yeah,
is the garbage truck that comes by every day and has a loud horn and also bells with it too. So yeah. But that's
fair.
also because I'm obligated now in my domestic life to go take out the garbage.
What profession, what profession, if you weren't doing yours, would you love to do? So yeah, yeah.
Oh. Um
Now you've worked as you've worked as like a seller in like a CD store. You were the central organizer of of the
yeah.
CBC in Canada. Right now you do full-time activism, with Mexico Solidarity and other stuff. So if you weren't
I
doing that, what would you love to
this is
do?
this is no indication of my love for Jerry Seinfeld, but it is the George Costanza answer, which is architect.
Architects would love to be an architect then.
Yeah, as a profession, yeah, I think housing is a really important thing. It'd be interesting to be able to be like an architect who worked with social housing and something like that. I think there's such a social element to architecture that's totally not thought of, but is really so critical. And I think, if there was some way to reboot my professional career and I had many more decades after socialism came to be, it would be to like do some sort of arc or just something around housing. I think is a really interesting
Okay,
field.
but then what profession would you absolutely not want to do under any circumstances?
Mm, TikTok influencer. I don't know.
Okay. And then final one. If heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say as you arrive at the pearly gates? Or whatever is your vision of the afterlife, and even if you're an atheist, please still answer the question.
You know what? It's been a good run, but I'm shutting this down. Let's bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. That's what.
Really?
Yeah.
Somebody's been reading their Beatitudes and Liberation Theology. Well, we were joined on this edition of One Plus One, our All Things Latin America edition, All Things Mexico, with our returning champion, Jay Watts, who is a photographer, historian, anti imperialist campaigner, flaming leftist, and member of Mexican Solidarity Campaign. Jay, thank you so much for coming back on the program, especially under such short circumstances, and on this historic second positive historic moment for Mexico, in which
Yeah.
Morena won under Claudia, and here's hoping she does well. And again, thank you so much for coming on, and I look forward. And let's not wait too long. We need to have you back on the show and do some more episodes related to like communist topics.
Sounds good. Thank you very much. Great to talk to you.